Welcome to From Here to Eternity, a Gateway Seminary podcast about the nations. My name is Phil Hopkins. I'm the host. I'm a professor of missions at Gateway Seminary. Lived overseas for a number of years until just recently. So I just came back a little over a year ago. And in this podcast, we are addressing topics that relate to the cross-cultural spread of the gospel, whether that be here in California, across the world, and in the U.S. And today we have Lamar Schubert. He is a worker who lives overseas, and he's done some pretty innovative things, and I want him to share his story with you. And thank you, Lamar, for being here. I appreciate you taking the time to come and speak with us.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks for thinking of us and having me on.
Hey, Lamar, could you just begin by talking about you're an American and you live overseas. Can you talk about that journey a little bit? What led you from being an American to going overseas and doing the work that you're doing?
Sure. I served in pastoral ministry here in Texas for more than 2 decades. And in about the year 2000, maybe 2001, I did my very first international trip. And it was to Kenya, to East Africa. And we were basically dropped in the jungle with the Maasai people, and the local cross-cultural workers said, I'll come back and pick you up in a few weeks. And so we trekked from village to village, sharing the gospel with people. And on that trip, Christ just awakened in me something I'd never considered before. And that was, the gospel is much bigger than my local church ministry. And the kingdom is much bigger than what I could have ever imagined. And he stoked in my heart something that began there. And when I came back to the States, I promised the Lord that I would make missions and cross-cultural work an integral part of any church that I led. So then fast forward to 2009, and I'm in East Asia with my whole family. My wife and my 7-year-old and 5-year-old were with me. And while we were there, we had a very successful church in the States. We were part of a planting team that was doing some great stuff, probably the best ministry position we'd been in pastorally when the Lord said it's time to leave Texas, leave that expression of local church and go where local church needs to be expressed, and to spread the gospel to see local church started. And so that started our process, and that was about 15 years ago that we left for the field. And so that's what we've been doing ever since. It's looked a little bit differently over the last 15 years, depending on where we are and what we're doing. But that's the short version of getting to living overseas.
Great. You have some pretty interesting experiences while you're living overseas. You're living in a part of the world that people kind of know about, but people kind of don't know about. Can you talk about that a little bit? And I don't want to say anything that you don't want to say. So all this stuff can be edited out, but I want you to, can you talk about that part of the world? Yeah.
Yeah. When we're back in speaking in U.S. churches, we realized that most Americans are geographically challenged. And until we moved into Eastern Europe, we couldn't have found most of the countries we serve in now on a map either. A couple of them, we hadn't even ever really heard their names. But we serve in Eastern Europe. Now, we started off in North Germany, planting churches in a city called Hamburg, and that's where our kids grew up. And then we moved into Eastern Europe, and probably the easiest way to describe it is I use 2 things. I say first, it's former Soviet Union countries that don't touch the Mediterranean. And the other way I describe it is the part of Europe that nobody in America knows exists. So we actually live in Budapest, which most people know exists. But when you get over into the Caucasus and into some of the Slavic countries, people don't know. And some of the names, we're surprised at the number of people that think Moldova is a country from the Princess Diaries and not a real place on the face of the planet. So, yeah, that's the part of the world we work in.
Okay. And were you concerned about going overseas with a family when you started? How did the process work out with you and your wife and your children?
Yeah, and if she were here, she could tell you that's part of her big testimony was we actually started feeling the call to leave and go as career cross-cultural workers in 2004 Our kids were 4 and 2 at the time, or 3 and 2, and about to be 4. And the security of raising kids overseas is really what held us back. And so we continued serving in the local church. But while we were in East Asia with our family, with our kids who were small at the time, a hostile environment, hostile to the gospel culture and government, and our kids plugged in and flourished. And my wife and I saw the potential of ministry, and reached a conclusion that God really is faithful. God really does care for us and care for our kids, and He's not going to call us to some place that He's not going to take care of us. And that was a determining factor for both of us. In our relationship, my wife has always been let's consider the implications, and I'm always well, let's just jump in and see what happens. But while we were on that trip in East Asia, the Lord made it very clear that where He takes us, He will care for us, and that included our children.
Okay, so you went to East Asia for a little bit, then you went to Northern Europe, to Northern Europe, and now you're in the Eastern Bloc countries.
Yes.
There's a lot going on. There's been historically a lot going on in the Eastern Bloc countries, whether it be with the breakup of the Czech Republic, Yugoslavia. You have the wars within the Southern Caucasus, and then you have Ukraine and all that as well. And you're right in the middle of all that. And how have you, talk to me about that. How, there's thousands of different languages, what seems like thousands of different languages in that part of it. How do you even communicate?
Yeah. So we lean heavily on our local cross-cultural workers in most of those places. I'm currently learning Russian, and when we lived in Germany, we learned German and we're fluent in German. So this is late in life, learning a third language. It's been a challenge. And so we do rely heavily on translators or our local expat community that are living in country. Sometimes we end up in places where there are no expats, there's no cross-cultural workers, and there's a lot of pointing and grunting and using Google Translate if there's a cell signal. Yeah, it can be challenging, but the advent or the popularity of English has also helped us. Very few of the large cities that we end up in Eastern Europe, very few of them can you get by. I mean, in most of them, you can get by in English. And so we've lived in Budapest for almost 5 years, and we're getting by in English just fine there.
What would you see as some of the cross-cultural differences between you living in the U.S. and then Africa, which everyone thinks is kind of like a big Africa? That's where the true missionaries go, right? In many sense, right? So that's at least that's the stereotype, right? And then now you're in the Eastern Bloc. There's this 3 very distinct areas, and what are some of the things that you've picked out that you think that surprised you the most?
Man, the thing that surprised me the most is how lost Europe is. That first trip that we took to Kenya, we had Maasai guides who would take us from village to village. And just about, I can only think of one that it wasn't so, just about every village we entered, using translators, we explained the gospel. We explained that there's a creator God who sent His Son as the last sacrifice to restore our relationship with Him. And entire villages would say, we are so thankful that we've heard this good news. This is the first time we've heard this good news, and we all want to follow. In Europe, that's not the case. It's obviously it's not the first time they've heard the story of Jesus, with it being the land of the Reformation, and in our part of the world, the home of Orthodoxy. But the communist influence is very real. Religion and the church, the Christian church, was used to spy on people. It was a tool for communist control. And so when we are actually out sharing the gospel with people in Europe, we have some cultural biases we have to overcome. And there's fear of the Orthodox Church finding out that someone was talking to an evangelical. And in some of the places that we've been, we've actually had people that won't talk to us in view of the Orthodox Church building. But if we go around the corner, around behind their house, then they're happy to talk to us. But What we found is in most of Europe, including the East, despite the Christian heritage or the presence of traditional orthodoxy, 99% of Europeans don't know the gospel. They don't know Jesus, and they will live their entire lives without anyone ever really explaining the gospel to them.
That's good. That's a good point. Huh. Now, many people who are listening to this, watching this, are maybe not as familiar with the Orthodox faith in comparison to Protestant Christianity, particularly probably Baptist Christianity. What are some of the things that you notice that are different? Not like doctrine, but just doctrine and practice.
It was heartbreaking the first time we went into a large, the Lavra in Kyiv, Ukraine. It's the big Orthodox temple. It's right in the middle of Ukraine, and there's a crypt underneath it. And the crypt has the entombed and mummified bodies of some of the church's saints. And the people who make pilgrimages to come into the presence of those saints and light a candle and hope that somehow the miracle working powers of that saint will transform their lives. It's heartbreaking. And of course, the church encourages it because you buy those candles from the church, and the church throughout the centuries, it's kind of been the same story. Those that get into power and can lord it over people will use it to their advantage, and it's no different in those circles. Also, you might find the occasional Orthodox priest who is kind and gentle, but you also will find the Orthodox priest who really believes that he is the distributor of salvation and that people need to do the things that he says for them to do in order to be saved. And in most of those systems, it's including praying to ancestors and coming into the presence of mummified bodies and candles and stuff that we normally don't associate with European worship.
So it almost sounds like similar to like Roman Catholicism in a sense.
I think for most Americans, if you were to go and spend any amount of time in an Orthodox service, you would struggle to tell the difference between Catholicism, although they will tell you they are vastly different. They really are very close in their orthodoxy, in the practice of their mass and the things that they do.
So you had mentioned a little bit about government, the connections of government with church, and how that's been a hindrance to your work. Like, can you walk with me with that a little bit? Because as you know, as an American, we pride ourselves in separation of church and state and religion and state. But in that part of the world, that's just not the case, if I understand, correct?
Yeah, that's correct. In the Orthodox world, most of the Slavic cultures will tell you, for instance, Ukrainian. To be Ukrainian is to be Orthodox. The governments are Orthodox. Now, Ukraine has a Jewish president at the moment, but the Orthodox Church is still the strongest church there. And the evangelical presence is just a little bit under 2%. And so although Ukraine is probably the most evangelical country in all of Europe, it's still part of their cultural identity. And in most of those places, even in Western Europe, to be a member of the church in Germany, for instance, you're baptized as a baby. You go through confirmation classes that are a 2-year process from 12 to 14. And then you pay your church tax. And that's what makes you a member of the church. And that's what gets you into heaven. In fact, our landlord in Hamburg came into our home one day, just broken. And I asked him what's wrong. And he said his son had lost his salvation. And so I pressed into that. It's not normal that you get to have this kind of conversation with someone, especially a person who's your landlord or someone that's not in a direct relationship with you. So I asked him, what do you mean? Well, how did he get his salvation and how did he lose it? And he told me his son had decided he was going to stop paying his church tax. And in no longer paying his church tax, he's no longer a member of the church. So he doesn't get to be buried on the church property. He can't have his funeral at the church, and he can't get into heaven. And that's a pretty standard belief across Europe, but especially in the Orthodox countries where it's part of their cultural identity as well.
Sounds like I remember Martin Luther saying something about that.
He had a lot to say about that.
Yeah, that's interesting. And so you're overseas. You're with your family. Your kids grew up much of their lives overseas, and now is it they're back in the States? Is that right?
Yes, yes. They would both tell you that they are as much German as American because their formative years were spent in Germany.
Mm. So, what type of okay? So I'm going through this with our son too, right? He's outside of the last year and a half, outside of being born in the U.S., he spent his whole life overseas, right? So now he's back, and I don't want to ask the question this way: what types of benefits and what types of challenges have your kids faced as being like third culture kids?
Man, I think the first benefit is they have passports and have traveled to more places than America. Their world is much bigger. Their worldview is much bigger. They understand the geopolitical scenery a little bit better. Being in the schools they were in when they came back to college, their first couple years of college were extremely boring for them because the high schools they attended were basically what our students here do their first 2 years of college.
Yeah.
So they were very well prepared educationally. And they were shocked. I remember when our son got back in the middle of his first semester, he said, "Dad, none of my friends have passports." I'm like, "Well, yeah, they probably have never traveled out of the country." And he just said, "I never realized that there might be people in the world who don't have passports." And so their worldview is much bigger, but that also made it hard for them to transition back to the States. We were doing house church planting in Germany, and when our son came back to the States, plugging into a large Texas Bible Belt church there's personal relationships inside it, but as an outsider trying to get in, especially for him as an introvert, trying to break into the 1,000-member church that's across the street from his campus, it was just something that he was very uncomfortable with. There weren't discipleship relationships for him to jump into. He even asked me a couple times, "Dad, is it normal for American pastors to wear skinny jeans and have smoke machines to help make their Bible points?" I said, "Well, that may not be typical, but you're also attending a college town church." And he really wrestled with that. And for both of them coming back, they were either treated like students from an international situation, or they were treated like, "Well, you're Texans, but you don't seem to quite understand our culture." And that whole that third culture thing, where they're neither American nor German, they're this new mixture of the cultures, and it's really hard for them to fit in. And they've really wrestled. And still, our son graduated almost 2 years ago, and he's still wrestling with it. Our daughter came to faith just over almost a year ago, and was baptized a few weeks ago, and is preparing to go on the mission field. So she's navigating it a little bit better, but she's also at a university now that has 80 or so TCKs on it, and they get each other. And so I think that's an important thing for them to find community when they get back that understands them.
Okay. So that is one of the things that I think people were thinking about going overseas. At least I didn't think about this. I didn't have kids when I went overseas, and the ramifications, the choices that we make as parents, as adults, really do affect our children. But you had kids, and you decided to go anyway. Was that? That was in that. That's obviously, and the Lord has blessed you with that decision. But you had mentioned a little bit earlier, you kind of struggled with that for a couple of years. Like, can you imagine you're one of the many? I mean, I imagine probably it's more the majority that kind of struggle with that. Can you articulate that a little bit and just explain how the Lord just softened both of your hearts to make that leap of faith and just go?
Sure. Family is important to us, and I didn't have any siblings really around me where we were living, but my in-laws lived very close to us, and we're very close to them. And our kids' grandparents and all of their formative relationships from elementary school. The church that we were serving in was a church that I had helped plant, and our kids had basically learned to walk in, and their Sunday school teachers and our youth workers from our youth ministry, these were the lifelong friends. And we really wrestled with, well, what happens when we get overseas? What happens to all of these formative relationships? And what happens when our kids are teenagers and they're not getting to have well, I call it the American dream childhood, where there aren't school sports, there's no prom, there's no homecoming, there's no school band. I mean, there's an orchestra if you're in the right track in the right high school, but by and large, anything that we do here in school that makes our time in school fun is done in special clubs in Europe. They're not done in the schools. And were we robbing our kids of the American dream childhood that we had had? And while we were there, those first couple of years, we realized they're going to make friends. They're going to make different childhood memories. And then when we really thought back on it, as memorable as prom was, is with the pressure around prom and all the things that go on at most of these events, and the elevation even now of sports to such a high, almost idol status.
Mm-hmm.
I'm in Texas. I'll tell you, high school football, and I'm in a college town right now.
Yeah.
And you don't plan things on Saturday because of college football.
Yep.
And our kids were actually going to grow up without that pressure. And there would be other things that would try to crowd in. And there always are. And that's really how the Lord moved us with confidence. It's about parenting your kids, no matter what the environment, and abiding with Him and letting Him bear fruit in you so that your kids grow up with a faithful witness in front of them. And they made their own experiences in Germany. High school students, actually, 6th grade, 8th grade, 10th grade, and then 12th grade. They do international trips. Our son got to go to Venice with his class. He got to go to London for one of them. They were in Portugal for one of their class trips. Hamburg's a coastal city, so their annual retreats for their schools was actually to go to an island in the North Atlantic. So it balanced out. But the presence of Christ and the faithful witness of parents, that's essential for your kids' upbringing, no matter where you are. And the Lord helped us realize that it's about parenting them where they are.
Okay. So you had mentioned a little bit ago that you visit a lot of these Eastern Bloc countries. You live now. You transitioned to Budapest, and it's by all accounts, it's one of the most beautiful cities in Europe, right? You're very blessed. But you go to some of the more edgy places, right? Like you mentioned Kiev, and there's a war going on, as you very well know, and it's been going on for a little while. How do you, as a Christian and also as an American, how do you navigate that? How do you navigate the politics of that whole situation?
Man, I was back at a retreat in North Central Europe when Donald Trump won his first presidency, November of 2016. And I watched Europe lose its mind.
Mm-hmm.
There's a German magazine called Der Spiegel, the Mirror, and the day after the the preliminary results were announced, their cover was this huge orange meteor screaming at the earth, and the trail behind it was really Trump's blondish, whatever color hair, and the caption said, "The end of the world as we know it." Mm. In Eastern Europe, they tend to lean the other way. They were waiting for President Trump to be elected this time because he had promised he could end the war in Ukraine. And conservative or fundamental people in Eastern Europe really align with what they know about him. But here's what we discovered. Just like Hungarian politics are pretty foreign to me, and even though I'll read the newspaper and see some things on TV and hear what people around me are talking about, I can't make an educated guess about what's going on. I can form an opinion, but I have to really understand that my opinion is probably wrong. It's uninformed, and it is an outsider's perspective that doesn't understand the system. And so we realized that most of our European folks that we're dealing with that are either closely aligned with the Democratic Party or closely aligned with the Republican Party, they only know what their media sources tell them. And they have very few media sources. And so we have just tried very, very hard to not engage in political conversation at all, both as insiders from the American system and outsiders in the European system. People just, it's too controversial. It gets too heated. And we really can't find common ground that way. And we want to get to the gospel. And so we actually train volunteers when they come to work with us. Practice this phrase. Well, I can see why you'd find that's interesting, but I didn't come here to talk politics. I wanted to share Jesus with you and then launch into the gospel. Because everybody wants to know about Trump. The first time he ran for president, this time, when people find out you're American, they ask you, what's your opinion on Trump? And your opinion on Trump as an American will never line up with their opinion on him as a European. And it only serves to put you in a box that they think they've got you figured out. And it limits your opportunity to share with them. So we avoid it altogether. And it's been a blessing to be able to avoid it, honestly.
Yeah, I understand. When we lived in Turkey, we'd have these conversations with Trump, was with Bush at the time. We go to Iran, and that's the first thing that people ask you about is your political. What do you think of Clinton, and what do you think of Bush? And I'm like, it's like, what do you do, right? And then like you kind of got to give a non-answer answer, right? Because even my opinion on that is so limited because I don't even live in America anymore. So what do I know? Right? So now it's interesting you say that. Yeah, I think that's a good word. In the area where you are, there are a number of seminaries that have just been around since like Soviet times, right? And just like really like, I'm thinking of the one in Romania. I think there's obviously one in Ukraine, and there's other. Maybe there's Rusicon, right? Back years and years and years ago. So you have these centers, these seminaries that are there, and do you have any like types of connections with them, and how does that work as like how do you go in if you have connections with them? Like what do you all do with them?
Yeah, we have in Eastern Europe. So when I lived in Germany, I had a few connections with what they called Bibelschulen. So they're not seminaries, but they're also not quite colleges. It's a Bible school. But as we've moved into East and taken over more responsibility for a larger area, we've realized if we want to have healthy partnerships in the countries where we're serving, we need to have at least some sort of relationship with the gatekeepers. And in most of the countries where we serve now, seminaries, they train the pastors, and the pastors and those seminary leaders are the gatekeepers. And so I actually teach at two of the Ukrainian seminaries. We have had in the past cross-cultural workers from our organization who have been on staff at those seminaries, on staff at the Romanian seminary, the one in Bucharest, and the one I think that's in Oradea in Western Romania. At one point, our organization actually held the deed to the Hungarian Baptist Seminary, and that's stored in our archives now. But when we first landed in Hungary, we had an opportunity to work with the seminary to help them figure out what do American credentials actually mean when somebody comes and says they'd like to teach. How do Hungarians understand American credentials? But in doing so, built a really good relationship with them. And most of the seminaries are tied to their Baptist conventions in those countries too. In Eastern Europe, they're called Baptist unions. And so my wife and I spent a significant amount of time figuring out where are those unions theologically and how deep can we go with them in partnership. But they all exist as brothers and sisters in Christ. And so unity with them and working towards community engagement and prayer is something we can do with any believer. And so even in places where a lot of our Slavic brothers and sisters believe you can walk away from your salvation. So the security of the believer is not something that's part of their theological belief. And so we work really hard to figure out in those Slavic countries, and we're not going to plant churches with people that don't see eye to eye with us on something that's like that. But we also know that just because a convention believes something doesn't mean that every leader in that convention believes the same thing either, right? And so that's part of our role, is discovering what's their general belief, and then who are the people and country we can partner with, and at what level. And so we do that through seminaries and through those unions in all 14 of the countries that we lead.
Wow. Huh. So you've been in ministry now in some form or fashion for close to 40 years. Is that about right?
Yeah. I was an intern when I was 18 years old. Then I went on to be a youth pastor from there when I was 19. So yeah, I'm 55 now. So what's that, 37 years?
Okay. 35, 40 years in ministry.
Yeah.
What would you tell your younger self starting off in ministry? What's the
man.
one thing you wish you knew 35, 40 years ago?
Don't be a jerk. It was important then. I was a new believer, and it was important then to prove that I knew something about the Bible, and to prove that I had valid opinions. And that probably, even more than I can look back and see how it hurt some relationships, because it was exclusive. And it was arrogant. It wasn't just exclusive. It was arrogant. And the longer I've walked with Christ, the more I've seen him shaping my theology on things that I thought were fixed and permanent. Because the older I get, the more I realize I can't even begin to wrap my brain around what he means when he says. I mean, I can get the basics, right? We can get the basics, but when I was 19 years old, like, no, this verse means this. And anybody that doesn't believe that is wrong.
Okay, so it's funny you mentioned this. So you probably saw things a bit more black and white 30, 40 years ago than you do. You see things are a bit more nuanced.
Yeah, nuance is a good word.
Yeah, okay. And if you were talking to like seminary students or people at Gateway Seminary, they're starting their master's degree, what's one piece of advice that you would give them?
Oh, man. Okay. You don't have to be the guy or the girl that's going to try and prove the professor wrong because you don't agree with them.
Okay. Interesting. Okay. What are the thoughts? That's good. Yeah.
It just seems like, and I'm guilty of it as much as anybody else was, but it seemed like a professor would stand up and present something, and then there was always that person in class that had to make sure that everyone knew they didn't agree, and here's why.
Okay.
And you don't have to let everyone know you don't agree. I mean, they're brothers and sisters in the faith, unless you think your professors are a heretic. Soak it in and understand that in another 20 years, you're liable to be standing up in front of a group of people actually saying the same thing that you're arguing against now. So there are black and whites for sure in the Bible. Very, very clear things, but then there are things that we want to take stands on that, I mean, they're convictions, and they're a light you've been given to walk in, but they're not a light that everyone's been given to walk in. And so allow that to color your interactions with your peers and your professors.
Okay. If now that you're over all these different places, that has put you in like a leadership position, and you have some type of authority over others. What do you see as some of the struggles that first term missionaries going overseas face, and how do you think, or is there a way for them to be better prepared through seminaries and through other ways coming overseas before they go overseas?
Man. Have we got another hour? Yeah, just in a very broad, sweeping stroke. When we show up overseas, we usually come with a list of things we're coming to do. And somewhere in our mind, there's this, I'm the answer to the struggles these people are having. In the process of trying to get to doing the things you came there to do, culture shock, language learning, family issues, they begin to just strip away whatever you think your identity was.
Yeah.
And what we're finding more and more is with less and less mission education in the churches, with fewer and fewer people talking about a calling to be a missionary, we have folks showing up just to see if they want to give it a try and live their best Christian life overseas. That calling is going to see you through when things get beyond hard, and they will. And they'll get beyond hard in the first year on the field.
Yeah.
And as your identity gets stripped away, if you don't have the healthy markers of a biblical, godly Christian identity, who is Christ and who am I made in his image and who has he called me to be? If those things aren't there, what you're left with isn't pretty. You begin to fall back on things that bring you comfort. A lot of folks find a church that, I found a church that lets me teach Sunday school. It feels like home. They love me. They want me. But really, the pastor's found a free gospel worker, and you're no longer really engaged in the missionary task. You're engaged in something that is part of your former identity from when you were in the States. And you'll find yourself ineffective in that missionary task. You might be a great church member and a great help to that church, but getting the gospel out to where Jesus is not being named becomes even more challenging.
That's a good word. One more question, and that's if you could. What would you, if with all the different work, all the people that are under you, what are some of the things that you want people in the States to know about the work that you all are doing in your part of the world? Is there anything you want to promote?
Well, for two things, I would say, first of all, Europe is lost. One of the things that we constantly bump up against when we're talking with the U.S. church is, well, do real missionaries even go to Europe? Why would you go to Europe? There's churches everywhere. There's Christians everywhere. There are empty cathedrals everywhere. And there are what one of the authors called it monotheistic therapeutic deism, I think.
Yes, I understand.
That we see in Western Europe, where people, they know they have spiritual needs, and if they find something that feels good, they just do it and consider themselves Christian. Europe is the darkest continent. By 2030, it looks like China will be the largest Christian country on the planet. The African continent is bumping up against 20% reached. There's awakening even happening in the Middle East and Central Asia. Europe remains that staunch, dark, been there, done that, post-Christian, but yet pioneer missionary field. And so when you meet missionaries who are going to Europe, don't think less of them and don't think that they're not real missionaries, because they are engaging the largest frontier on the planet right now of lostness.
That's a good word.
And then the other thing is, if you're coming over to join us in our work, come and let the missionary tell you what helps them, and don't bring an agenda of, well, we came to do this, and make a missionary find a way to plug you in.
Oh, I could tell you stories, man. I tell you, you get me in trouble. So we'll talk about that offline. Yeah. Well, great. That is good to hear. That's a good word. Do you want to talk? I mean, full disclosure, Lamar is working on some pretty intriguing ideas. I'm looking forward to seeing what you write, and I'm looking forward to seeing what that looks like in the next few years. So maybe we'll have to have you on here in a little bit once all that is done, because I don't want to burst your bubble, and I want you to talk about it when you're ready to talk about it. He's got some really good things going, some things that I think are really going to be really important to some of the things that you've talked about. So thank you for coming, and I look forward to talking to you in the future.
Yeah, thanks for having me, and I look forward to it.